I never thought one careless joke would end with legal papers delivered to my door. But that is exactly what happened when my husband discovered the affair I had insisted was only in his imagination. My name is Isolde Wren. I am 34 years old, and I work as a marketing assistant, where I spend most of my time around colleagues who like to flatter and joke, which always made me feel important. My husband Thomas is 37, a high school history teacher who has always been steady and calm. And for years, I convinced myself that calmness meant weakness. We have 2 children, Clara, who is 9 and thoughtful beyond her years, and Peter, who is 6 and always shadows his father, copying every gesture with innocent loyalty. When I started getting attention from my coworker Daniel Voss, I told myself it was harmless and that Thomas should not complain because I was only enjoying small flattery. When Thomas asked why I came home late or why Daniel messaged me often, I laughed and told him he was overreacting because in my mind I believed he would never act against me. My mother Helene defended me as playful, while my sister Marianne shook her head and said I was going too far, but I ignored her because I enjoyed the attention. Thomas's father Edward had warned him many times that I disrespected him, and I rolled my eyes whenever he spoke, confident that Thomas would never take real action. What I did not see was that his silence was no longer sulking. It was building into something I never expected, and while I laughed at him for being jealous, he was already gathering every piece of proof. The night I found the documents on the table, signed and stamped, I finally realized that the story was no longer mine to control. After the papers arrived, I tried to convince myself that Thomas was bluffing, because in all the years we had been married, he had never once followed through on a threat, and I believed he would eventually fold the same way he always had. I told myself that if I acted confident enough, he would feel guilty and withdraw, and that had always been my trick when I needed to escape trouble. But this time was different, because instead of arguing or retreating, he simply went about his days with a steady calm that made me uneasy, and I noticed that even Clara and Peter responded to his quiet strength. Clara began asking me fewer questions, no longer sharing school details with me, while Peter followed his father constantly, copying his movements and leaning against him during dinner as though I were not even there. I tried to accuse Thomas of turning the children against me, but he looked at me calmly and said nothing, which made my anger grow because I had nothing to push back against. At work, I tried to distract myself with Daniel, and I told myself that his attention proved I was still desirable and fun, while Thomas was simply boring. We stayed late at the office some evenings, and I convinced myself that it was not truly betrayal, because I was only enjoying the attention. When Thomas asked about my schedule, I told him he was paranoid, and when he pressed, I pretended to be hurt, saying he was accusing me unfairly. My mother Helene supported me, saying men should not be so jealous, while Marianne scolded me, reminding me that I was playing a dangerous game. I brushed her off, saying she was jealous, even though deep down I feared she was right. Then one evening, Thomas came home early and found my phone left on the counter with messages from Daniel open, and although they were not explicit, they were enough to show closeness I could not explain away. When he asked me about them, I laughed and said he was overreacting again, but he only nodded and walked away, which unsettled me more than shouting ever could. Later that night, I checked his study and found a folder filled with bank statements, printed screenshots, and even notes about the times I had stayed late, and instead of panicking, I told myself he was pathetic for keeping such records. But the truth was that I felt a chill in my stomach, because I knew evidence like that could not be erased with charm or tears. Edward praised his son for finally standing up for himself. Marianne stopped taking my calls, and even my own children began avoiding my company, which left me isolated in a way I had never experienced. I told myself I was still in control, but every day Thomas grew quieter, calmer, and more prepared, while my world slowly began slipping away piece by piece. The real shift came during a dinner out with friends, when I decided once again to play the role of entertainer, because I hated how Thomas's silence made me feel invisible. We were sitting in a busy restaurant, and I leaned into the conversation, joking that Thomas worried too much about my coworker, and that Daniel probably gave me more compliments in 1 week than Thomas had in a year. Everyone laughed uncomfortably, some covering their faces, while Thomas sat still with a faint smile that looked more like resignation than amusement. I brushed it off and said he was being uptight, and I told myself I had won the moment. But inside, I felt unsettled by the way he excused himself early and left the table without even looking at me. When I came home later, I tried to accuse him of embarrassing me in front of everyone, but he simply nodded and went upstairs, which made me furious because I could not twist his silence into guilt anymore. Clara asked quietly if her father was angry, and I told her he was just tired, but I saw the suspicion in her eyes, and that suspicion stung more than Thomas's coldness. Peter refused to sit near me at breakfast the next morning, clinging to Thomas's side instead, and I realized that even my children were starting to choose him over me. At work, I complained to Daniel, saying that Thomas was insecure, and Daniel laughed and told me not to worry, but I could see in his eyes that he was not someone I could rely on if things got worse. Marianne called me later and said I was humiliating my husband in public, and I told her she was exaggerating, but I knew from her tone that she had already lost respect for me. My mother Helene defended me again, insisting that Thomas was too sensitive, but even her words felt thinner now, like she was struggling to believe them herself. Thomas's father, Edward, visited us the following weekend and pulled his son aside, and when I overheard him say that it was time to protect himself, I felt a sudden wave of panic I tried to disguise as annoyance. That night, I checked Thomas's study again and found new documents, including a printed copy of the photo a co-worker had posted online, showing me and Daniel sitting far too close during after-hours drinks. I slammed the folder shut and told myself he was bluffing, but my hands shook as I walked away, because I knew the truth was no longer hidden. Still, I clung to the belief that Thomas would never go through with real consequences, because I had convinced myself for years that his calmness meant weakness, even though it was now becoming the strongest weapon he had. The days after that dinner felt like walking on thin glass, because every move I made was being watched, not only by Thomas, but by Clara and Peter, and I realized I was losing my audience in the very house where I once controlled every conversation. Thomas stopped asking me where I was going, or when I would be back, and that silence made me feel both free and terrified, because I could no longer twist his questions into guilt or turn his doubts into paranoia. He prepared the children's meals, checked their schoolwork, and even handled their bedtime, while I drifted through the rooms like a guest, trying to joke or demand attention. But nobody laughed anymore. Clara avoided me whenever possible, quietly slipping her drawings to Thomas instead of showing me, and Peter began following his father so closely that I felt like I was fading from their world entirely. I told myself this was only a phase, that children always sided with the calmer parent during arguments, but deep down, I knew my own choices had driven them into his arms. I leaned harder on Daniel during work hours, needing to believe that someone still admired me, and I convinced myself that our connection was harmless fun even though the messages piling on my phone told a different story. When Thomas found one of those messages open on the counter, he did not argue or accuse me as I expected. He only nodded once and walked away, and that simple gesture cut me deeper than shouting ever could. I stormed after him, demanding that he stop acting like a victim, but his silence made me feel small, and I hated how powerless I was becoming in the house, where I used to feel untouchable. My mother Helene continued telling me that Thomas was too sensitive, that men often overreact, but her voice lacked conviction, and I could see even she was beginning to doubt me. Marianne refused to return my calls entirely, which told me that even my own sister had finally decided she was done defending me. Edward came by again and spoke firmly to Thomas in the garden, telling him it was time to act before I destroyed more of the family, and when I confronted him about it, he only glared and said nothing. That evening, Thomas locked his study, and when I asked why, he replied calmly that some things were private, and my stomach twisted because I knew exactly what he was protecting inside. I tried to joke about it, saying he was overreacting, but the laugh caught in my throat when I remembered the folder of documents I had already seen, filled with dates, receipts, and that photo of me leaning too close to Daniel. I told myself he would never take it to court, that he would never drag our children through something so ugly. But then, a week later, a courier arrived at the door with an envelope that made my hands tremble before I even opened it. Inside were formal divorce papers and notices about custody arrangements, every page marked with signatures and stamps that made the reality undeniable. I screamed at Thomas that he was tearing our family apart over nothing, but he stood calm and steady, saying the law would handle everything, and I knew in that moment that my words had lost all power. Clara watched from the staircase with wide eyes. Peter clung to his father's leg, and I realized with a sick feeling that even in their young hearts, they already knew which parent was protecting them and which parent was lying. I called my mother, begging her to tell him to stop, but she could only sob on the phone, while Richard stayed quiet in the background, ashamed. Marianne told me flatly that she would not interfere, and Edward praised his son for finally standing tall. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the papers spread across the wood, tracing the lines as if touching them would make them fade. But they stayed solid, as unshakable as the silence that had turned against me. For years I believed Thomas's calmness meant weakness, but now I saw it for what it truly was, the weapon he had sharpened quietly while I laughed at him, and the weapon that had finally cut through every lie I had ever told. The courthouse was the final place where every illusion I clung to shattered, because once we entered that room, there was no hiding behind charm or laughter, and the walls felt heavy with judgment I could not escape. Thomas walked in first, holding Peter's hand, while Clara stayed close to his side, and the sight of both children leaning on him without hesitation pierced through me in a way I could not disguise. I told myself they were nervous, that children often cling to the parent who seems stronger, but deep down, I knew they had already chosen him long before we stepped into that building. My parents sat behind me, my mother Helene whispering that everything might still be fixed, while my father Richard avoided my eyes entirely, already defeated by the evidence he knew would be presented. Marianne sat across the aisle with her arms folded, refusing to look at me, while Edward placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder with quiet pride. When the judge asked for statements, I launched into my old routine, claiming that Thomas was distant and jealous, that I was only being playful, and that my co-worker Daniel had never been anything more than a friend. I tried to say Thomas had overreacted, that every husband felt some jealousy, and that his father had poisoned his mind against me. But my words sounded thin even to myself. Then the lawyer opened the folder Thomas had been building for months, and piece by piece, my stories collapsed under the weight of proof. There were screenshots of messages between me and Daniel that I had deleted, yet Thomas had already captured them, showing late-night exchanges and jokes that left no room for denial. There were receipts from restaurants and bars near the office, perfectly matching the evenings I had claimed to be working late. There was even the photograph from a co-worker's social media, showing me and Daniel sitting too close at an after-hours gathering, my hand brushing his arm, while my smile betrayed everything I had tried to hide. I wanted to laugh it off as harmless, but the look on the judge's face silenced me before I could. The lawyer also produced witness statements from 2 co-workers who had seen me leave with Daniel after drinks, and suddenly, every denial I had planned felt childish. I tried to gaslight one last time, insisting that Thomas had twisted everything into betrayal. But when asked directly if the messages were real, I had no choice but to admit they were. Clara lowered her eyes, refusing to look at me, and Peter clung tighter to his father, while Edward's expression hardened with satisfaction that justice was finally here. My mother wept quietly and begged Thomas to forgive me, but even she could not explain away the evidence, and my father kept shaking his head in shame. Marianne did not speak at all, but the way she turned her face told me I had finally lost her completely. When it was Thomas's turn, he did not shout or accuse. He simply laid out the timeline of my behavior with calm precision, showing how he had gathered every detail until the picture became undeniable. The judge listened carefully, then spoke the words that sealed my fate, granting Thomas custody protections and financial control, stripping me of the family I thought would always remain mine no matter what I did. I sat frozen, unable to breathe, while Thomas stood with quiet dignity, gathering our children close as though nothing else in the world mattered. Clara reached for his hand without hesitation, and Peter leaned against his shoulder, both of them looking safe, steady, and secure, while I sat alone on the other side of the room. I realized then that the calmness I mocked had been the foundation of his strength all along, and that my laughter, my gaslighting, and my arrogance had only carried me to this moment where I had nothing left to say. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed like the closing of a door, and I understood that Thomas had ended the story exactly as he planned, with proof stronger than my words, and silence sharper than any weapon. Walking out of the courthouse felt like stepping into a world where the ground no longer belonged to me, because the judgment had been made, and there was nothing left for me to twist or control. Thomas left through another door with Clara holding tightly to his hand, and Peter resting against his shoulder, and the three of them walked together like a unit that no longer included me. I wanted to shout after them, to remind them that I was still their mother, and that I could still make things right, but the words caught in my throat because I could already see in their faces that they had chosen him fully. My parents followed me quietly, my mother Helene whispering that appeals might be possible, though her voice shook with doubt, while my father, Richard, walked with his head low, saying nothing at all. Marianne passed by without a word, her eyes cold and fixed ahead, and that silence cut deeper than if she had shouted, because it meant she no longer saw me as her sister worth defending. Edward walked proudly with his son, his hand still resting on Thomas's shoulder, and I hated the way he looked at me, as if he had been right all along. That night, when I returned to the house, the silence felt unbearable, because every corner reminded me of the family that had slipped away into Thomas's steady arms. Clara's drawing still sat pinned on the refrigerator, but I knew the new ones would never come to me again, and Peter's toys lay scattered across the floor, but I knew soon they would be packed and taken elsewhere. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at the divorce papers, tracing the signatures again and again, as if touching them could undo what had been stamped and sealed. I wanted to call Thomas, to beg him to come home, to tell him I would change, but I knew he would not answer, because his silence now belonged to the lawyer and the court. I thought about Daniel and felt sick, because he had already vanished from my life the moment things turned serious, leaving me with nothing but shame and evidence that destroyed everything. I thought about every time I laughed at Thomas and told him he was overreacting, every time I told friends he was too jealous, every time I joked about being admired at work, and I realized those jokes were not harmless. They were daggers that had slowly cut him away from me. I had convinced myself that control was mine, that his calmness was weakness, that my charm would always outweigh his suspicion. But standing in that courtroom and seeing him win with quiet dignity showed me how wrong I had been. He never needed to shout, never needed to threaten, never needed to match my arrogance, because he had been patient, careful, and determined, and those qualities had become the tools of my downfall. The children had already chosen him before the judge ever spoke, because they had seen the truth long before I admitted it, and their trust had shifted quietly to the parent who never lied. I told myself for years that I could laugh away consequences, that I could bend the truth until people stopped asking questions, that I could gaslight and distract and charm my way through anything. But now I understood those tricks only delayed the inevitable. The silence that once irritated me had become my prison, because in that silence, Thomas built the case that ended everything, while I wasted my breath convincing myself I was untouchable. And as I sat alone at that kitchen table, the papers spread before me, I finally understood that my laughter had carried me here, to the end of my marriage, the loss of my children, and the collapse of the life I believed I controlled. That evening, after the ruling, I sat at the kitchen table, long after the house went dark, staring at the stack of legal papers that carried my name like a brand, because no matter how many times I traced the ink, the words did not change. Every page was proof that Thomas had done what I had always sworn he would never do. He had acted decisively, and he had ended the life I thought would always bend around my choices. I poured another glass of wine and told myself he was being cruel, that he had overreacted, that any husband in his place would have forgiven. But even as I spoke the words in my head, I knew they sounded hollow. The truth was that I had mocked him too many times, pushed him too far, and humiliated him in front of too many people, and his silence had never been weakness. It had been patience sharpening itself into action. Clara's room stood empty, and the sight of her drawings pinned on the wall made me feel sick, because I knew she would no longer rush to me with new ones. She would run to him instead. Peter's little shoes still sat by the door, but they already looked abandoned, like artifacts from a childhood that had moved elsewhere. And I realized with a heavy heart that I had lost more than a husband. I had lost the children who once trusted me. My mother Helene called again to say I should stay strong, but her voice was thin with doubt, and my father Richard said nothing in the background, his silence more cutting than words. Marianne refused to take any of my calls, and when I sent her a message begging for help, she only replied that I had chosen my path and should face it alone. Edward's look from the courtroom haunted me, that steady pride as he walked out with his son, because I realized he had seen this outcome coming years ago when I first began mocking Thomas, and I had laughed in his face. Daniel had vanished completely, deleting messages and avoiding me at work, leaving me stranded in the wreckage he had helped create, and I felt humiliated knowing I had thrown away everything for someone who never planned to stand by me. I thought about the night Thomas first asked about Daniel, how I had laughed and told him he was overreacting, and I realized that was the moment I set this entire chain of events in motion. I thought about the dinner where I humiliated him in front of friends, telling them he was jealous and insecure, and how he left the table without a word because that was the moment I should have seen the resolve building in his silence. I thought about the folder in his study, the notes, the receipts, the photo from social media, all the evidence he collected while I continued laughing, and I understood now that he had been building the wall that finally trapped me. I tried to imagine what the children thought when they saw me in court, fumbling for excuses while their father stood steady, and I knew in my heart they saw the truth more clearly than I ever allowed myself to. They had seen who was dependable and who was reckless, who was honest and who twisted stories, who was safe and who was not, and their choice was made long before the judge gave his ruling. The silence in the house pressed heavier than ever, because it was not just Thomas's silence anymore. It was Clara's, it was Peter's, it was Marianne's, it was Richard's, and even Helene's, because none of them could defend me against the truth. I told myself for years that jokes were harmless, that gaslighting was just another way of keeping peace, that flattery from others was innocent fun, but now I sat in the ruins of those lies and realized they had become the rope that pulled everything away from me. The man I called weak had shown me what strength really was, not in shouting, not in threats, but in patience, evidence, and silence that cut deeper than any words I could have thrown. And as I stared at the documents spread across the table, I finally admitted to myself that the family I thought would always forgive me had slipped forever into his steady hands, leaving me with nothing but the echo of laughter that had carried me. Here, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching, watching.